So it's an honor and privilege for me to have Laurie Hazard with us. And I heard Laurie Hazard at Bryant University give this speech on leadership. And when we started planning this summit, before I left my company last year that I was working for, the first person we called was Laurie Hazard. Because we can do all of these activities, we can have these wonderful breakout sessions, but if it's not grounded around leadership, it can fall through the cracks. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Laurie Hazard to the stage, so thank you.
Is there a little shelf in there? Okay. Good morning. I am really excited to be here today, and I wanted to just start out by thanking Kelly and Sal for inviting me here today to talk about the things that I do to help students be successful. And I just want to give you a little bit of my background so you can understand the perspective that I'm coming from. So I'm the Assistant Dean for Student Success at Bryant University, which is a university in Smithfield, Rhode Island. And the field of student success really began to emerge about 30 years ago when colleges and universities were noticing the high dropout rates for first-year students as students transition from high school to college. And so at the time, educators in higher education were really asked to take a look at this question of what's going on here. What is causing students to drop out after their first year, after they've achieved success in their high school years, and then they're coming to our colleges and universities and they're not able to persevere? So that's where my area of research lies, and I will say that my background is in personality psychology. So I've been studying the personality traits, habits, and behaviors that create success. My main focus of my research is in what's called achievement motivation, that asks this big question of what creates the need to achieve in human beings. What makes an Olympic athlete persevere so they achieve in that field? And I will tell you that the habits, personality traits, and attitudes that create the need to achieve in human beings cuts across all domains. What creates achievement in the workplace, on the playing field, in the classroom, for musicians, for engineers, for any field, it's really the same personality, habits, traits, and attitudes. So I am going to outline some of those for you, and we're going to cover some conceptual territory. Because I come from a higher education perspective, some of the research that I'll be sharing with you is focused on this idea of what creates success in colleges and universities. And I will do just another little disclaimer. I'm a fast talker, and I have a lot of stuff to cover, and I think it's going to be really fun, so strap yourselves in. I'm going to ramp up to 5th gear here, and we're going to go really fast, so stay with me. So today's objectives, we want to ask and reflect on really big questions in education. And what we want to do is begin to understand what those habits of mind are, the personality traits, habits, attitudes, behaviors. In doing that, we're going to try to take a big dive into social cognitive theory, and we're going to reflect on the 21st century skills that you've been talking about for the last few days. There are certain external environmental variables that are really affecting the process of education now, K through 12 and in higher education, so we're going to take a look at those. And then we're going to look at it from the individual perspective, look at those personality traits that augment achievement. And we're going to identify affective variables, those emotional components that really augment achievement, and the habits of mind for success. And we're going to look at ways that maybe our students can assess themselves a little bit so that they can take a look at themselves and figure out, how am I doing in terms of my mastery? And then we're going to consider ways that you can maybe help cultivate some of those habits. So one purpose of education is what we call disciplined inquiry, right? This idea of asking big questions. And so in the last couple of days, I've been listening, and I've heard some of the big questions that have been asked, like, where is my place in the world? How big is the universe? To what extent is the Earth different than other planets? What cultivates the need to achieve? In curriculum development, the big question is what is most worth knowing? And for the most part of the 20th century, when curriculum designers and teachers and educators asked this question of what is most worth knowing, we really tended to focus on the content of the curriculum and content knowledge. And we know in the 21st century, we have to move beyond focusing on the content of curriculum and content knowledge and move into other types of skills. I heard one of the speakers, Chip, ask the question of how do we create moments that matter? Today we're going to focus a little bit on this idea of what leads to success. Anthropologists ask the big question of what's going on here, but what we're really going to reflect on today is what are the habits of mind for successful leaders? So if you think of what level of education you're working with students, you want to think of the students as emerging leaders and how can you begin to cultivate those habits at every level of education. So for much of the 20th century, we really used the educational philosophy of John Dewey. And his ideas influenced our educational practices. But that's morphing in the 21st century. So John Dewey talked about habits of mind, and I'm just going to give you like 30 seconds to kind of read through these and think about them. And then I'm just going to pick one or two to talk about, because I look at them and I go, what does this mean anyways? What does all of this stuff mean, habits of mind? But when you hear that term today, it originated with John Dewey's work in 1918, and it's taken all different pathways. So I'm going to just pick one of them. Impulse is the dynamic phase of a habit, and I'm going to just ask you all to raise your hands. Who uses the snooze alarm in the morning when they're waking up? Okay. So in personality psychology, we say that that is what is called a situation-behavior relationship. And at young stages, situation-behavior relationships get cemented together, and habits are hard to break. So if you're in elementary school, right, if you're teaching in an elementary school and you have kindergartners arrive, there are a lot of situation-behavior relationships that are already cemented. So we think we're developing habits as students come to school, but some of the habits are already cemented. And we're going to get back to that snooze alarm question in a few minutes here. So these are the habits of mind that John Dewey talked about in terms of what creates success. But we're going to work our way through habits from other researchers, and we're going to ask that question of what creates success. And I'm going to present you with a lot of different information because some of the things that I'm talking about today are going to resonate with some of you. Other things might not resonate, but I hope that I hit on something that resonates with everybody in the room. So we ask big questions, and that actually, if you ask folks in higher education, what is the purpose of higher education? It's to ask the big questions. So as a researcher in this idea of what creates success in higher education, I've been asking this question for a long time, and I just want to share with you a perspective of one researcher who took a look at this question of what creates success and how he frames the idea of success.
This is really a 2-hour presentation I give to high school students, cut down to 3 minutes. And it all started one day on a plane on my way to TED 7 years ago. And in the seat next to me was a high school student, a teenager, and she came from a really poor family. And she wanted to make something of her life. And she asked me a simple little question. She said, what leads to success? And I felt really badly because I couldn't give her a good answer. So I get off the plane and I come to TED. And I think, geez, I'm in the middle of a room of successful people. So why don't I ask them what helped them succeed and pass it on to kids? So here we are, 7 years, 500 interviews later, and I'm going to tell you what really leads to success and makes TEDsters tick. And the first thing is passion. Freeman Thomas says, I'm driven by my passion. TEDsters do it for love, they don't do it for money. Carol Coletta says, I would pay someone to do what I do. And the interesting thing is, if you do it for love, the money comes anyway. Work. Rupert Murdoch said to me, it's all hard work. Nothing comes easily, but I have a lot of fun. Did he say fun, Rupert? Yes. TEDsters do have fun working, and they work hard. I figured they're not workaholics, they're workaholics. Good. Alex Garden says, to be successful, put your nose down in something and get damn good at it. There's no magic. It's practice, practice, practice. And it's focus. Norman Jewison said to me, I think it all has to do with focusing yourself on one thing. And push. David Gallo says, push yourself. Physically, mentally, you've got to push, push, push. You got to push through shyness and self-doubt. Goldie Hawn says, I always had self-doubts. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't smart enough. I didn't think I'd make it. Now, it's not always easy to push yourself, and that's why they invented mothers. Frank Gehry said to me, my mother pushed me. Serve. Sherwin Newland says it was a privilege to serve as a doctor. Now, a lot of kids tell me they want to be millionaires, and the first thing I say to them is, okay, well, you can't serve yourself. You got to serve others something of value, because that's the way people really get rich. Ideas. Tedster Bill Gates says, I had an idea. Founding the first microcomputer software company. I'd say it was a pretty good idea. And there's no magic to creativity and coming up with ideas. It's just doing some very simple things. And I give lots of evidence. Persist. Joe Kraus says persistence is the #1 reason for our success. You got to persist through failure. You got to persist through crap, which of course means criticism, rejection, assholes, and pressure. So the answer to this question is simple. Pay $4,000 and come to TED. Or failing that, do the 8 things, and trust me, these are the big 8 things that lead to success. Thank you, TEDsters, for all your interviews.
So I wish that I could just show that video to my first-year college students and then be done with it. But we all know that academic achievement and success is a little bit more complicated than that. So you continue to explore this idea of what leads to success. And then I come across years ago Malcolm Gladwell's work, and now he's got this idea of what leads to success. So let's take a look at that. But one of the things that he kind of pointed researchers in the direction of is that you can't just look at individual characteristics. So if you look at Richard St. John's Secrets of Success, it's all on the individual and what they have to cultivate in themselves in order to be successful. And then Malcolm Gladwell argued that we also have to look at the environment. But then when I look at his 10 Secrets of Success, I see all of these things put the responsibility, if you will, for success starkly on the individual. And so what I really want to talk about is the person-environment interaction and how that mediates success. So we're going to look at sociocultural and individual factors that mediate success and achievement today. We're going to talk about possible barriers to achievement. There are generational insights that we really have to take a look at for a thorough understanding. We have to kind of think about the personality traits that lead to success and achievement. And so we're going to work our way through some theoretical frameworks. I'm going to show you some case studies, and I'm going to give you some ways to think about behavior change. So if we talk about social cognitive theory, it's this idea of the person-environment interaction. This is Albert Bandura's work. He talks about reciprocal determinism, where the individual can exert control over the environment, but the environment also can influence individual behavior. So I'm just going to share with you a personal example. Years ago, a friend of mine who I went to the University of Rhode Island with, and we had graduated, but our basketball team was in the Elite 8. So she said to me, hey, Laurie, do you want to go see the URI basketball team? They're in the Elite 8. And I was sort of enthusiastic about it, but not terribly enthusiastic about it. But I was like, sure, your dad's got free tickets, let's go. So off we go to this basketball game. And I'm in the audience. It was at the Providence Civic Center. And there were people with their bodies painted in blue and gold because they were so excited about this tournament. And all of a sudden, the URI fight song comes on. And everybody starts standing on their seats and yelling and screaming and clapping and singing the URI fight song. Now, if somebody had asked me before I went to this game, Laurie, are you going to be standing on your chair singing and screaming the URI fight song? I would have said, absolutely not. But don't you know, I got caught up in the environment, and there I am. Rhode Island born and Rhode Island bred, and when I die, and all of a sudden the environment changed what I would have predicted about my behavior. So there is a strong relationship between the environment and the individual, and we're going to really explore that in terms of the domain of success and achievement. And we want to acknowledge, and with my students, I take a psychoeducational approach with them, and I want them to really reflect on what does mediate their ability to engage in the pursuit of achievement. And these come from the internal part of the human being and the external environment. I was just having a conversation with somebody who said her son struggled during his first year of college, not because he wasn't positioned to do well academically, but because of his living situation and his roommate. So the environment created a situation that detracted from his success and achievement. So I really want students to think about how these factors can mediate their ability to be successful. And I think if you look at these, you can put these ideas at any level of education, right? Friends can derail students, particularly during certain developmental stages, right? In high school, students can get a lousy friend group, and then that can derail their ability to do well. So we're gonna work our way through thinking about some of these factors that mediate success and achievement. So what I want to talk about first is the larger environment of what's going on outside of education, particularly what's going on outside of higher education. And what's happening in higher education, and I've heard some of these concepts being discussed here over the last couple of days, is that higher education is under fire. Industries, government, higher education is being asked this question: what do students know and what are they able to do by the time they graduate? And we're being forced in higher education to be able to articulate this. And so at my university, we started really thinking about this, and we said, what are the skills that students need to be successful as 21st century employees? So we did research with government, industry. We really took a good look at the American Association of Colleges and Universities and the national surveys. And we got some answers about what we're being told students need to know and be able to do in the 21st century. And I'm sure because you've been having these conversations over here the last couple of days that you know it has less to do with content knowledge, but with particular skills. So from the individual perspective, these are the 21st century skills that students need in order to be effective employees. So if I think about this in terms of answering big questions, so I'll give an example. Should we have health care for every single person in the United States? That's a big question, right? And in order to answer that question, we need to have the people who are involved in this conversation to have effective communication skills, right? There are different stakeholders in this question. There are the people who are seeking health care. There are the insurance industries. There's the medical industry. There are all different stakeholders, and we have to think about the question, should everybody have equal access to health care, or should it just be certain groups? And what are the ethical implications if we don't give everybody access to health care? And there's so much information out there that our students have to be information literate to sift through all of the information to answer these complex questions. And at our university, we also have students do design thinking. We have this, and this is something that I would just suggest, is there a way that you can implement design thinking into your curricula in some way? The way that we've solved the problem of getting our students this 21st century skill of design thinking is we have this 72-hour experience for our students in between the 2 semesters, and they're asked to solve a real-life problem and go through the design thinking process. What I'm primarily going to focus on today is the scholarly self stuff and the student success. So the student success field really focuses more on emotional intelligence factors and what emotional intelligence factors are needed for student success and achievement. So this is the conceptual territory we're going to cover as we talk about this idea of developing emerging leaders. We're going to look at those theoretical frameworks like I mentioned. We are going to explore generational differences. At no other time in our history has there been a situation where there are 5 generations in the workplace. 5 generations are in the workplace right now. And so that's affecting the way that we're functioning. We're going to consider individual pull factors that can detract from student success. And we're really going to talk a little bit about, for our students, families as stakeholders in a way that maybe you haven't conceptualized before. And we're going to reflect on the implications of family involvement, and then this idea of how can we engage parents and families to help us create success and achievement for our students. So first, we're gonna, this is gonna be kind of like a grounding concept that I'm gonna give you the definition of psychology, and I'm gonna give you an example, and I want you to kind of use that as the backdrop for the rest of my talk. So psychology is the study of behaviors and mental processes. And in personality psychology, we say that a healthy human being, their behaviors and their mental processes are congruent. That is, that they match. So behaviors are anything that are observable. So I'm observing some of you taking pictures of the slides. I observed some of you chuckle during the Richard St. John video. So if I were to draw a hypothesis about what does laughing mean, that behavior, that a hypothesis about their behavior, or somebody shaking their head or making eye contact with me, what does that mean? You're with me, right? So I can observe those behaviors and say, okay, everybody seems to be with me, but I don't know what's going on with your mental processes, your thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. Some of you might be thinking, oh my God, I gotta catch a flight later, and I gotta get to checkout after this talk, and I'm thinking about that. I don't know what's going on inside, right? So I'm gonna give you an example of how this manifests. A number of years ago, I had a friend who asked me if I would run a 5K. So what we do when we're asked to meet a goal, what human beings do when they're asked to meet a goal, is they kind of reflect. So I go, oh, 5K, I don't know about that. And I said to myself, self-concept, I am not a runner. So right away, the chances of me making the 5K are a little bit lower, right? Because I assessed myself and said, I am not a runner. But I was like, okay, wait a minute. I need information. So in order to reach goals, we need information. So I said to somebody, what's a 5K anyway? Because I didn't know the metric system. So what is a 5K? 3.1 miles. So I'm like, all right, now I say, have I had prior experience? Because what leads to success is, I'm confident that I can do it, and I wasn't so confident because I am not a runner. I need information. Now I have the information, so a roadblock was removed. I've got the information now, 3.1 miles. And do I have a prior experience? So I said, oh, well, I was on the tennis team at the University of Rhode Island, and we used to have to run 3.1 miles before practice. So I do have prior experience. I can do it, but that, quite frankly, was the suckiest part about being on the tennis team, having to run 3.1 miles before practice. But I knew I had the prior experience, so I could do it. So now here's what happens. Laurie's enacting the behavior. I'm running. I'm enacting the behavior of running. Behavior's going well, and then the thoughts come in. Oh my God, I'm too old for this. My knee is killing me. I can't do this. And then the feelings are coming in. When's the runner's high gonna happen? I thought adrenaline rush should be happening and I should be floating on air now. What's going on here? I can't do this. So my behaviors and my thoughts, feelings, and attitudes didn't reach congruence. Do you think I finished the 5K? I did. You know why? Because sometimes you got to fake it till you'll make it. So how can we get our students to persevere? But if you think in terms of a goal-setting process, when you're giving a student a project, a goal to meet, they're going to think, can I do it? How confident am I? Do I have all the information and support that I need? Right? Do I have all the information and support that I need? Am I going to persevere through those thoughts, feelings, and attitudes that might prevent me from reaching my goal? So there's this whole process that human beings go through when they decide whether to engage in the pursuit of achievement. The other piece of this is, and I actually heard Chip Heath talk about this too, these transitions. So human beings go through several developmental transitions through their K through 12 experience and as they transition from high school to college. And every time a human being goes through that transition, there are different adjustment factors. And adjustment takes time. And sometimes we have too high expectations of human beings that, okay, they were in 6th grade last year, now they're in 7th grade, they're in junior high, they should be ready. Well, development takes time. And I can speak for myself, right? Because right now, okay, I'm in middle adulthood. I used to be in adulthood. Now I'm transitioning from adulthood to middle adulthood. And sometimes accepting that we're moving through these ages and stages take time. So look, I've got bifocals on. I'm not even wearing them. I'm in denial about needing these. I'm in denial about the chunky monkey here, right? I used to be able to like just reduce my calories and the chunky monkey over here would be gone. So getting used to becoming a leader, becoming a middle adult, becoming an adolescent, these transitions take time, and I think as educators we need to be a little bit more patient with our students as they're going through these developmental stages. We are going to go through these different adjustment issues and how that mediates change at different developmental stages. So let's talk about another environmental factor, this idea of generations in the workplace. And I am not going to have you all raise your hands, but I do want you to look at the different generations that we have in the workplace right now and just situate yourself in terms of where you were born. So I was born in '66, so I'm on the cusp between Gen X and the baby boomers. So we're going to take some time right now to reflect on environmental factors external to our field of education, external to the field of education, and sort of ask that question of what's going on here and how do generations in our educational system and how do generations in the workplace affect the work that we do. So I won't ask you to raise hands, but everyone's got themselves situated. So a big question for educators is who are today's students and how do we meet them where they're at in terms of which generation they fall into. So I just wanted to kind of take a look and have you compare Millennials and Gen Z. And I am going to say right now, like Malcolm Gladwell would say, there are obvious outliers to some of these patterns. So I am only giving you patterns from the research, and there are obvious outliers to these patterns. So we are seeing some shifts in Gen Z and the way that they're approaching their educational experience, particularly when it comes to the pursuit of higher education and college. So the implication that has for the STEM fields, are students going to be seeking those opportunities? And right now, some of the research is saying that our students are less interested in going to college. Gen Z is less interested in going to a four-year college. So what implications does that have for us? It's interesting that some of the recent research that's coming out is saying that these students they crave more face-to-face, and we've moved so far in the direction of the social media pieces and delivering curriculum in an electronic fashion. So maybe we think about a more hybrid approach if this generation is starting to tend and crave more face-to-face. So I want to know, can you speak Gen Z? So I'm going to give you a few minutes at your table and see if you can come up with a definition of these terms. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes there at your tables. See if you can come up with okay, Are you ready for the big reveal here to see how you did? I feel like this is a constant struggle for those of us in the classroom, right? To be connected to the students in our teaching and learning environments. So here we go. How'd you do? So I realized as a young faculty member years ago, when I was teaching Intro to Psych, and I wanted to teach anal retentive personality, I started out using, and some of you might not even recognize this, I started out using the odd couple, Felix and Oscar, to teach anal retentive personality. And there was a point at which my students glazed over, and I'm like, oh no, they don't know the odd couple anymore. And so the next cultural reference I went to was Friends, because one of the characters on Friends has an anal retentive personality, Courtney Cox's character. And then there was a point at which my students started glazing over, and I'm like, don't you guys have Nick at Night? What the hell am I going to use now to teach anal retentive personality? So it reminds me that I'm constantly having to immerse myself into the culture of my students and situate myself where they're at. And I think it's just something good for us to reflect on. So here's what's happening in terms of students, and you're developing these leaders in K through 12 to pursue STEM fields. But what's happening with this generation right now is they're much more skeptical about the cost of college, and that really does dictate their college choice. There is absolutely, with parents and family and students, the question of what is the return on my investment. And I will say for first generation students and minority students, they are much more skeptical. The research is clear in this area. What we're seeing happening in higher education, that students are purchasing only necessities, they're not buying their books, which is making things more challenging. Digital books are cheaper, and this is just kind of an aside. I have been following the research on moving to digital books, and it's not good, folks. We know that reading comprehension and memory retention is served much better the old-fashioned way of reading and doing text annotation. It solidifies the information much better than reading online, because what happens online is there's something called switching costs, and it causes cognitive overload. So we're reading online, and then there are hyperlinks, and we go to the hyperlinks, and every time we move to a hyperlink, we're having to refocus. So it actually, without the students knowing, it creates more frustration for them because it disrupts their focus. So I'm really trying to follow this research, because I'm concerned about this movement to digital books and reading everything online. So we know that Gen Zers are digital natives, and our students now are digital natives. So what does this mean? Many of our students who come to higher education, they're not illiterate. They know how to read, but they're what I call alliterate. They don't do the same kind of sustained focused reading that we did a generation or two ago. And the fact of the matter is that college still dictates that kind of reading. So I share with my students, and this creates a real deer in headlights, and for you high school educators out there, this is something to kind of think about. A basic first-year college curriculum dictates that students probably need, depending on the major, to read about 400 pages of reading a week. And most high school students, the research shows that they don't do that much reading, maybe 20 or 30 pages a week, and then we're asking them to do 400. So how do we scaffold them? Well, here's a quick tip that I give my students. Reading is like running. They can build their endurance for it. They should do reading in sets and reps. So if they do reading like weightlifting in sets and reps, I say to my students, you've got 400 pages of reading a week to do. I'm going to tell you, go ahead and take weekends off. How does that sound? Pretty good, right? So you're going to read Monday through Friday, 400 pages, 5 days. 80 pages a day. You're going to do 20 in the evening, 20 in the morning, 20 at supper time, right? Read them in sets and reps. They can do it. We just have to give them really concrete strategies of how to get through the reading. And we also maybe need to give them social media dryouts, which is also a good strategy to do. I'm a digital immigrant. When I went off to college, I asked for a typewriter. And the advent of the personal computer was when I was in college. So these Gen Zers are digital natives. And what's the impact on teaching and learning? This is from the research that we know the impact on teaching and learning with these digital natives. And some of the sociocultural stuff that is happening externally, which we're going to dive into. So we know that this generation has more difficulty tolerating criticism. So I want you to reflect for 1 second on this idea of design thinking that asks students to go through the design thinking process and be comfortable with failing and failing fast and going to the next iteration. But there's a clash, right? Because these students tend to fear failure. So we have to provide them multiple opportunities for improving, and I have to chuckle when I think about my university's design thinking 3-day experience. We grade it. Really? We just told them that they didn't have to worry about failing. We want to think about the switching costs and the attention span with the online reading. We know that these students tend to be visual learners and they favor that modality. But think about the kinds of kinesthetic learning activities that they have to do, particularly in the STEM fields. So how are we going to close that gap? And again, as I mentioned before, they're craving face-to-face. So there are some things that we can do. We can deliver hybrid models to them. So I want to kind of do a little historical reflection on why we find ourselves where we are. This is Jean Twenge. I don't know if you've heard about this book or if you've read it, but I would recommend it. It is a research study, but it's accessible. It's a really accessible read, and you could read it on the beach. So she is a personality psychologist at San Diego State University, and she did this research study taking a look at this question of, are the generations really different? And does that have an impact on what's happening? Are the generations really different? Her work is unprecedented because look at the sample size. 1.3 million Americans she studied over the course of her career. She went into master's theses and dissertation archives and looked at personality traits across the generations. And she did find clear generational differences, and here's where the cutoff was, pre-1970 and post-1970. And one of the questions that she asked, I'm just calling out one little tidbit from her study, one of the questions that she asked is, for students who were born pre-1970, parents were asked, what do you want most for your children? And for students who were born post-1970, parents were asked, what do you want most for your children? And there were some real distinctions between the pre and post-1970. That seems to be where she found this cutoff for how we're parenting for particular outcomes. So I'm going to give you a few minutes at your tables and see if you can guess. If you were asked, what do you want most for your children? Parents pre-1970 said very different things than post-1970 parents. So at your tables, discuss this and see what outcomes you can come up with. I didn't mean this. Okay, so let's take a look at the outcomes for children born pre-1970. What outcomes were we parenting for? Parents said, I want my children to be good Christians, I want them to be hard workers, and I want them to be obedient. And so what's changed? And now I know the research, and I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old now, and this research study came out a number of years ago. And I know the research, and I found myself falling into the same trap. You know, I teach at a university, I have summers off, I'm home all summer with my kids, and I'm like, oh my God, what do you guys want to do today? Oh, you're not happy? You want to go to the beach? You want to go to the pool? Do you want to have a play date? What do you want to do? And I fell into the same trap myself, but what is clear here is that it's a shift in parenting practices. If you look at the outcomes for good Christians, hard worker or obedient, you're probably leaning more toward an authoritarian parenting style. If you're parenting for outcomes of being happy, independent, and open-minded, you're maybe leaning more toward democratic or permissive parenting styles, and that manifests in a teaching and learning environment. How does it manifest in the teaching and learning environment? For those of you who were at college or university 30 years ago, you remember you used to get your syllabus and it had the required readings and the recommended readings? And students would actually do the recommended readings because they were just being obedient. There's no such thing as recommended reading on college syllabi anymore. Yeah. Are you doing them? Yeah, good for you guys. What Jean Twenge's research looked at was changes started happening because of the self-esteem movement in the 70s and 80s. We thought that what would help students with the pursuit of achievement was to really increase their self-esteem. And if you look at the idea that scholarly articles doubled during this time period, so there was this real self-esteem movement. Grade inflation has boomed during this time period. And again, as I mentioned before, we're looking at patterns of the research, and of course there are outliers, as that table just so aptly mentioned, right? There are outliers to some of the findings. So here are some of the characteristics of Generation Next and our college-bound students, and you see some of the characteristics with Gen Y and Z and the Alpha generation that's coming up. And I really want to focus on the sort of bottom quadrant of this slide, that what is distinctly different is the extent to which students maintain close contact with their parents and family in ways that they didn't do a generation ago. So our families are part of the educational experience in ways that they were not a generation or two ago. One of the personality traits that we have seen change in our culture is this rise of narcissism that has been connected to the self-esteem movement in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So if you take a look at this, it's striking that California as a state hasn't seen as much of a change in this personality trait of narcissism. And you might say, oh, that's because, you know, Hollywood's there and they're narcissistic anyway. So no, it is because of the Asian population. They're in this in the culture of California and that collectivist culture that hasn't focused so much on the individual. That's where this finding comes from. But what are the implications of the rise of narcissism? I'm going to just give you a minute to kind of look at some of the implications. one of the outcomes of this rise of narcissism is emotional coping skills go down as narcissism goes up. So I want you to take a look at, this was written on one of my evaluations. So my self-concept is, I think of myself as an accessible professor. I think of myself that students can come to me with, oh my gosh, any issue in the world, and I am gonna support them, I'm gonna be with them, I'm gonna help them work through whatever issues that they're having. I'm the person that's gonna help them remove the barriers to their success and achievement. So I look at this feedback and I go, oh my God, did I do that? And I go running to my filing cabinet and I open the drawer and I take out the manila file folder with the student's name on it, and I look and I go, I didn't remove 20% of her grade, what is she talking about? And instead of coming and talking to me, which she didn't do, she never approached me, and because she was absent so much that semester, I couldn't hook her in to talk to her. And you see this sort of blame of what's happening on an outside variable. And so how do we shift students to think about what's my role in my ability to be successful? So we've seen a big shift in where does the responsibility lie. And again, I know there are outliers and some of this stuff is exaggerated, but it's just to drive the point home that we are seeing some differences. So indeed, for those of you who have been in your careers in your field for 20 or 30 years, I'm guessing that you have seen a shift in how parents are interacting with the school community. We've seen it in higher education. I am telling you right now that higher education is in this incredible dilemma in terms of how do we interact with parents, because we do know from research that parental support augments college achievement. So how do we enlist parents to help us once we get the students to college or university? How do we enlist the support of parents to help us support their students, but from a healthy distance? Because I am sure that you have heard some of the research on helicopter parenting and lawnmower parenting, right? You've heard these terms. Helicopter parents, lawnmower parents, they shouldn't be involved. It's detrimental to their student success. But once again, the research shows that parental involvement is important for college success, but perhaps more important for minority students and first-generation students. So how do we enlist minority student and first-gen parents to help their students in the pursuit of achievement? So who are our stakeholders? It's our families, it's our students, and it's all of us, the institutional stakeholders. And here's what's happening, right? There's conflicting messages in the research. There's conflicting messages in the media. So how are we going to mediate these issues and sort of put on our critical thinking caps and figure out a way to enlist parents to help us, because we all have the same goal for our students? And so at the university level, we've kind of taken a step back and said, you know, when we dive into the literature, we say, it's absolutely true that we were wrong in expecting that parents would just back off once a student got to university, because if we think in terms of the messaging in many communities, K through 12, what does it mean to be a good parent? You're involved in the PTA, right? You're involved in the PTA. You're baking cookies. You're going to the reading circles. You're going to all of the sporting events. You're involved, and then we expect them to back off at the college level. So we are really struggling with how to mediate this for parents and families. One of the reasons that we're seeing these differences is this idea of shifts in the social clock. So now I'm shifting from talking about a personality psychology point of view to a developmental psychology point of view. When we think about, for example, Erickson's stages of psychosocial development, right? It's childhood is elementary school, we shift to adolescence in junior high. Then students shift to young adulthood in high school, and then they move on to college, and then they shift into middle to late adulthood. Researchers are now kind of looking and saying, there's something else going on here, and there's this other stage. As we move students into high school and then into college, there's that 8-year period that the literature is now saying we want to conceptualize it as emerging adulthood. And how can we support students from high school to college to career, so that emerging adulthood stage. So we're kind of conceptualizing the developmental trajectory and thinking about how can we support these emerging adults during this developmental stage. And so in terms of emerging adulthood, it's resulted in the shifts in the social clock based on the delay of marriage and parenthood. And again, if you think intergenerationally, and I think of my mother, she had children for the first time at 20, and I did at 36. One generation, and there's almost a generational difference. There has been increased accessibility to higher education, and we're shifting to this knowledge economy. And what's happening for students at that age and stage is that identity exploration. And that big question of what am I going to do with the rest of my life, and how do we steer them to kind of reflect on that. And really now, today, I remember I drove myself to college. I got in a car and drove myself to college, and now parents are charged with facilitating that successful passage. My children's father died 2 years ago, and now I'm like, oh my God, I hope I can just get them through college and into their first jobs with health insurance. And I feel responsible for that successful passage in a really heavy, weighted way. And I don't think my parents felt that same way in terms of being charged with that successful passage. So I think what we need to do as educators is acknowledge that all of these educational transitions and these transitions through developmental stages, and this is focused on the first year of college, that there are adjustment tasks not only for students to work their way through as they're making this transition, that there are adjustment tasks for parents. And I think colleges and universities who are getting it right are acknowledging this. Because if we can support parents and families, it's really going to augment our what we call retention rates. I mean, think about all of the work that K through 12 educators do to get a student into college, and then the dropout rates they're abominable. It's like 65% of students, our national average, make it to their second year. But if we can work with parents and families, I think we can close that gap. And so I think as educators, what we can do too, as we're working with parents, and I have a friend from elementary school who has told me very similar stories that I hear in higher education about parent involvement and how that can mediate her relationship with her student and mediate her relationship with her families. We maybe could do a mindset shift, right? Because at colleges and universities, we would say like, oh, the parents just want a return on their investment. That's why they're involved. And it's really not. It is that concern that they want what we all want for their students, and that for their students to be successful. So can we shift our mindsets to think differently about parent involvement? So where do we go from here? We've kind of looked at the socio-cultural issues that are external to the institutions of higher education. And now I want to look at some internal issues related to the individual and how those augment success. But my argument would be to take a psychoeducational approach with parents and students and to share some of this research with them. So I want to talk about different theoretical frameworks that can inform the development of successful leaders and what mediates success and achievement. So we're going to take a look at the definition of learning. So learning, we're going to ground the next few minutes of our talk in this definition of learning. So if you look at an intro psych textbook, right, it says the definition of learning is a relatively permanent change of behavior based on experience. So somebody touches a hot stove, they have that experience, they're never going to touch a hot stove again. But that's just a behavioral change, right? So when we think of learning, we want to complicate the idea of learning and think about not only changing behaviors, but changing cognitive thoughts and changing affective feelings and changing behaviors. And we also want to think about, once we're working with students, can we get them to reflect on that experience? So I'm just going to ask you the big question. Is there space in your curricula, if you're in the classroom with students, that you allow them time to reflect on their experience? So, what I would like you to do is to think about an experience that created a relatively permanent change in your behavior, and how long did that behavior change last? So, I'll give you an example. I went to the dentist a number of years ago. I go every 6 months, and every time I go, the dental hygienist says, "Oh my God, Laurie, you haven't been flossing." I'm like, I know. I know I haven't been flossing. Talk about developing daily habits, right? It's a real struggle. I know I haven't been flossing. And she said, "Well, you know, you got to get flossing." And I'm like, "Well, I do for like 3 weeks after I leave my 6-month appointment, and then I do for 3 weeks before my 6-month appointment." As much as I've tried, this behavior has never been embedded into my daily repertoire. Never. Probably giving you too much information about me, but I want you to really think about behaviors that you struggle with being a consistent part of your daily repertoires. And think of an experience you've had that has permanently changed your behavior. So I'm going to let you discuss that at your tables for a few minutes. So I'm sure you've come up with some examples that lead you to the conclusion that behavior change and permanent behavior change is not easy. And I always reflect on, if some of these hard things I can't figure out for myself, how am I supporting my students through learning and behavior change? So we're going to talk about some learning theories that are related to cognitive change, affective change, and behavioral change. So one thing that I have students do is this is for like homework and studying and what obstacles might get in the way. And I have them kind of reflect on their study-related behaviors and identify in their study-related behaviors, and when they're trying to self-discipline to do their homework, what's getting in the way? Is it coming from the internal or external? Is it about them, or is it about the environment? And I want them to think about how they feel when they're studying. And I just love this. This is author Coombs, and this goes to the content process debate we have all the time in education. And I know a lot of you are embedding the social and emotional learning into your curricula. And I just think it's so important. And I always, when I have faculty members kind of resist that, because it's a little harder in higher education to get them to buy into the social emotional components of learning, I just love this Arthur Coombs quote: "What do you want, education for intellect or adjustment, as though we have to choose between smart psychotics and well-adjusted dumbbells." That resonates with me. So why effective education? Why the social emotional component of education? Why give human beings the time to reflect on their thoughts and feelings related to the pursuit of achievement? And we make meaning, right? Human beings make meaning. Learning is the personal discovery of meaning, and feeling and emotion are all indicators of meaning. I'm sure that some of you can reflect on a time during your K through 12 experience where something happened and it turned you off to a certain subject. Those big moments, right? And I remember for me, it was in the 3rd grade. We were learning long division, and math started making me really nervous. And it was first period in the 3rd grade every year, and I got a stomachache, and I stopped eating breakfast that year. And then all of a sudden, in my self-concept, I am not good at math, right? That got embedded into my self-concept in the 3rd grade, and I believed that all the way up until college. So when we think about the pursuit of achievement and the affective variables in learning, we think about our self-concept, right? I am not a runner. I am not good at math. Math is threatening to me. I feel like I don't belong. It seems like when I was in elementary school in my science class, the boys were getting all of the attention in science and the girls weren't, so I don't belong in this class. It's also how we conceptualize the concept of intelligence, right? So we're mostly going to talk about emotional quotient, and some of these seminal works that got us to start thinking beyond the traditional IQ. Howard Gardner's work around multiple intelligence, Daniel Goleman's groundbreaking work, and David Livermore's cultural intelligence. So, the attributional theory of achievement motivation. We know that individuals use causal elements to predict achievement-related events and behaviors, and they have certain ways that they perceive their success and failures. And so when we put a challenge in front of a student, they're thinking, is this chemistry class going to be really hard for me? Am I good at chemistry? I wonder how much effort I'm going to have to expend in order to master this material. And is my ability level there? Maybe I can pull it off with some luck. You see, grit is another way that we think about getting students to persevere. And this got really popularized, the idea of grit. So I think when I said before that some of these theoretical frameworks resonate with some individuals, when I present grit to my students, some students really like the idea of grit and thinking about grit in terms of perseverance, and that idea that failure is okay. And there's this link on here that will get you to a grit assessment for students so that they can kind of assess their level of grit, which I think students like to do. But what I'm going to spend some time talking about is locus of control, because this is my area of research. So locus of control is a generalized expectancy that individuals hold regarding the degree to which they can control their own fate. And it's a personality trait. And when we talk about personality traits, we talk about personality traits in terms of them existing on a continuum. Do you tend more toward an internal locus of control, or do you tend more toward an external locus of control? So an internal locus of control is when students believe that they have control over their own outcomes in their lives. They operate under that belief system. Some people operate under an external locus of control where they believe that the outcomes in their lives are controlled by luck, fate, chance, powerful others. Here is the deal with this personality variable. We look at this personality variable in terms of college success. It predicts with about 35% variance college achievement, particularly during the first year. So if we look at SAT scores and high school grades combined, they predict with about 25% variance college achievement. Really, I would argue that SAT scores do a craptastic job of predicting college achievement. They really do. Locus of control is a more powerful predictor of academic achievement. Here's how it manifests. A number of years ago, I worked at a university where there were health science and nursing majors. I had a student who was a nursing major, and she failed her first chemistry test. And she came running to my office crying, "Oh my God, Dr. Hazard, I failed my chemistry test. My dreams are dashed." She was catastrophizing. "I'm never going to be able to become a nurse." So I'm like, okay, let's take a deep breath, sit down. We looked at her syllabus. We looked at all of the different assessments on her syllabus. We crunched the numbers. Her lab grade, her test grades, all these if-then propositions, and we figured out that she could actually pass the test with a B or higher, because the nursing majors had to have a B average, thank God, right? You want your healthcare professionals to have a B or higher. And we figured out she could do it. So she goes and she studies, and this is a student who I know would utilize the study strategies that I taught to her. I knew she would. I gave her some science-level study strategies. How do you attack a biology textbook? She comes running into me after her second test, and she goes, "Oh my God, Dr. Hazard, I got an 85 on that test. Thank God the professor made that test easier." And I'm like, "Oh my God, what are you talking about? You did it. Internal locus of control." But she was still attributing the outcomes in her life to external variables. This is a very powerful predictor of academic achievement, and I believe if we can take a psychoeducational approach with students and teach them about this personality trait and how it manifests in their lives, we can move the needle with achievement. The problem is that the research shows that this personality trait has been changing with these generational shifts. And so as educators, particularly in higher education, we feel like we're shoveling shit against the tide, because we really want students to have an internal locus of control, and if we can build working on that personality trait into our curriculum, it's going to help. And in fact, my research bears that out, that you can move students from externality to internality. It's harder work than it was 10 or so years ago. The interesting thing is some institutions of higher education are using this non-cognitive criteria for admissions purposes. And we know that students who operate under an internal locus of control, again, are more likely to have higher grade point averages. So at my institution, as students are entering the university, we give them the Trice Academic Locus of Control scale, we assess them, and if they're high in externality, we do interventions with them immediately. So there is an engineering college that is using this for an admissions criteria now. So what I ask educators to do is pay attention to your students' musings and how they're making sense of their academic experience. Because you can see an external locus of control manifested in this case study. The professor is the powerful other, right? So is this an internal or external locus of control? Internal or external? What do you think? External locus of control, right, with the powerful other being the parent. So we can assess locus of control. There's a flyer on your table. There are these interactive videos that a company generates called student lingo videos, and there's a student lingo video called What It Takes to Be a Successful Student, and there's the locus of control assessment is on that. So I would just ask you to sort of reflect on ways in which you can think about this idea of locus of control and the attributions that students are making for their success and failures, and are they internalizing them or externalizing them, and how can we get them to make the connections that they create it all, right? That they have the power, and give them that confidence. I'm sure you're also familiar with mindset. So some of my early research looked at this idea of how students conceive of intelligence. So Carol Dweck, a Harvard psychologist, I know many of you are familiar with her work. She argues that students who operate under a growth mindset are more likely to involve themselves in the pursuit of achievement. So those with a growth mindset believe that intelligence is malleable. It's a controllable property that the students can augment through hard work and effort. People who operate under a fixed view of intelligence believe that intelligence is inborn and they can't change it. So again, if we look at the pursuit of achievement, there's a correlation between an internal locus of control and growth mindset. What we know from research is that students who operate under a fixed mindset are less likely to utilize the study strategies that we teach to them. They're less likely to use the study strategies that we teach them. If they operate under an external locus of control, they're less likely to utilize the study strategies that we teach to them. So if we can shift them to an internal locus of control and a growth mindset, they're more likely to utilize those study strategies that we teach to them. So how does this mindset work? Well, I often hear students say, you know what, Dr. Hazard, I really stink at math, and I stink at math because my mother does too, and I was just born with a bad math gene. There's nothing I can do about it. So why should I go to the tutoring center and get help? Because even if I go there, it's not going to do anything. So if we can challenge those musings of students and teach them about growth mindset and fixed mindset, teach them about internal locus of control and external locus of control, and challenge those musings and those negative cognitive patterns, self-talk, that they utilize, I think we can close some gaps. So I want you to take a look at this case study and see if you can identify whether the student has a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. It feels like she's somewhere in the middle of the continuum, right? She says it's not a God-given thing, so she's kind of like operating under that fixed mindset, but she does realize if she studies hard, she can make a difference. So she's really kind of in the middle of this continuum. So giving students space and place to reflect on these mindsets and these attitudinal variables and processing that with them, if you can find the space to do that in your curricula. So there are ways to, I want to just give you some resources in terms of learning more about mindset and assessing mindset. And an activity that you can do with students and morph it a little bit for your grade level. So at your tables for a minute, if you can just take one of these statements that is revolved around a fixed mindset and turn it into a growth mindset statement. Just choose one either individual or one at your tables, and switch these musings and these statements from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, and we call that cognitive restructuring. So we look at the attributional theory of achievement motivation, how locus of control can inform our work with emerging leaders, how getting students to think about mindset can cultivate some of the habits of mind of leadership. And I also want to reflect a little bit on transformational learning theory. So transformational learning theory comes out of Mesereau's work, and he talks about how can we create a situation where students have an apocal experience. I think another way of saying that is the power of moments, but in transformational learning experience, we call that an apocal experience. So you can probably reflect back on your own education when you had an apocal experience. And one that I can remember for myself is I took a women's studies class in college, and I learned, and I didn't know this, I learned at the time that women were making like 65 cents for every dollar that men were making in the same field, and it created this like epiphany for me, this apocal experience. It changed my feelings, it changed the way I thought about the world, and then it changed my behavior because it mobilized me to become a feminist. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to do something. I tell my college students, you've got to work on social justice here, people. I want it to be a buck for a buck by the time my daughter goes to college. She's going to college in the fall. It's still only 86 for every dollar. I'm going to be dead by the time it's a buck for a buck. But that created an apocal experience for me. So another theory that we can think about in terms of learning and behavior is the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. So I want you to think back on the behavior that I asked you to think about before. That behavior that you said, what experience I have that created a relatively permanent change in behavior. Now I want you to think about it in terms of stages. I like this model because it creates a good roadmap for students. If I'm helping them work through behavior change in a certain area, they can stage themselves, and then it gives them a roadmap of where to go. So if we take my silly example of flossing, right? I'm in contemplation stage with flossing all the time. I do have an intention to change. I've been in preparation stage, and I've bought every flosser known to humankind. Every single kind, the water pick, the long ones, the short ones. I've gotten into action stage, but then I always regress back to contemplation stage. It's really hard to get students to maintenance stage with habits. It's really hard to get human beings to maintenance stage with habits. So I just want to give you a minute to think about another behavior maybe, or the behavior that you thought about before, and stage yourselves. So reflect on a behavior that you've been trying to change, stage yourself, and think about a behavior where you reached maintenance. Can you kind of think about different behaviors? And let's go back and stage yourself. So when my students are telling me they're struggling with sustaining doing homework every single night, or they're struggling with reading, or they're struggling with the behavior of asking for help, or going to department night in high school, or going to see your professors in their office hours. I want them to kind of look at these stages and stage themselves, and then talk about strategies that we can use to move them to maintenance stage. So for those situation, behavior, relationships, and habits, how can we get human beings to move to maintenance stage? And I really like this, to take a psychoeducational approach with students and give them this roadmap. So if we think of the trans-theoretical model versus a transformational model, I like the trans-theoretical model because it gives students a way to stage themselves. But the transformational model, I think, helps them dive in a little bit different. And at any stage of education, students will have what we call disorienting dilemmas. And if you can grab onto a disorienting dilemma, an experience that doesn't fit with meaning systems or meaning structures, and we can create that apocal experience, that's the power of those moments. It's another way of talking about the power of those moments. So I'd like you to think about a disorienting dilemma that you've had. What happened? What was the dilemma? How did you go through, cope, and handle the experience? And what underlying values kind of led you through those experiences? So I'll give you a silly example. A number of years ago, I was asked to create a website. And I was like, I can't create a website. I don't know how to do it. So I didn't have the know-how. And somebody told me, well, Laurie, just pay one of your students to do it. And I said, I can't pay one of my students to do that. That would be weird. That's like kind of a conflict of interest. I can't have my students do it. So people kept giving me solutions, and I was being what we called the help rejecting complainer, right? Here are the solutions, Laurie, and I kept rejecting them. Well, why don't you teach yourself how to do it? Well, I don't have time. I've got 2 kids. I have to do bath, bedtime, homework. I don't have time to do this. Help rejecting complainer at every turn. And so I started thinking about having to do this. I had a publisher come to me and saying, you are the only person in our publishing group that doesn't have a website. And I'm like, okay, I'll get it done. It took me like 10 years to get it done. I'm not kidding. I procrastinated that behavior for 10 years, not exaggerating. And I finally had to look at my values and assumptions underlying why I wasn't able to follow through and do that behavior. And it was because of that idea of shameless self-promotion. It didn't fit with my value system. I'm not going to put a website up there with my face on it and then have people like look at it. That's gross. I was like, I can't do it. So I want you to think about how sometimes your underlying values and assumptions mediate how you decide to get into the pursuit of achievement and the pursuit of your goals, and go through this processing of a disorienting dilemma. I'll give you a minute or 2 to do that. So think of a dilemma that you've had, how you handled the experience, and then what underlying values or beliefs either held the behavior or prevented the behavior from happening. So one of the biggest disorienting dilemmas for students as they transition from high school to college is what we call getting a handle on their self-regulatory behaviors. We know very clearly from research that self-regulatory behaviors are at the heart of being successful in college. We know that high school study strategies don't work to the same extent in a college environment, that SAT scores only account for a small percentage of predicting college achievement. So when we talk about self-regulatory behaviors, I told you earlier that locus of control predicts with like 35% variance college achievement. Self-regulatory behaviors account for another 35%. So when we're readying students for college and we're readying emerging leaders, we want them to have a handle on the attributions for their successes and failures, what comes from the external environment, what comes from the internal, from the person, but we also want them to get a handle on their self-regulatory behaviors. So I want you to think about this idea of what self-regulatory behaviors are, and I want you to brainstorm at your tables, what are self-regulatory behaviors when you think about that term? What are self-regulatory behaviors? I'm going to give you a minute of think time to think about those self-regulatory behaviors. So here are a host of self-regulatory behaviors. And when we think about readying students for college, I kind of think about self-regulatory behaviors around 4 pillars. And I'm going to call it time management just for a second. The ability to manage time, the ability to combat procrastination, the ability to self-motivate, and the ability to do goal setting. Here's the issue that many of you know. The part of the brain that's responsible for self-regulatory behaviors is the frontal lobe, those executive functioning skills. And for males, those don't fully develop until about 24 years of age. For females, it's a little earlier. So it's really challenging for students in a college environment to get a handle on these self-regulatory behaviors. Alan Lakin at Harvard in 1972 coined the term time management, and I would like to kick him in the butt because there's no such thing as time management. We cannot manage time. It's a fixed commodity. There are only 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. The only time that we have extra time is during leap year. Every 4 years. That's the only time that we have extra time. So I want my students to think about it in terms of behavior management, not time management. So often students will come to me and say, oh, I did my planner and I went to the library from 2 to 4 and, well, I did get on Snapchat and I did grab a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So they're managing their time slots, but not their behavior. As soon as you talk to students about it in terms of behavior management and self-management, they think about it a little bit differently. What's very challenging for students as they move up through different grade levels, and you've probably found this, but it's particularly challenging for first-year college students, is they don't understand time on task concepts. They don't understand time on task. So I'm going to say something to you, and I'm going to let it hang in the room. Experience breeds the ability to predict time on task. Experience breeds the ability to predict time on task. So when I think about somebody asking me to do something, like writing them a letter of recommendation, I've done tons of them before. I know it's going to take 30 minutes. So I can look at my to-do list and say, writing that letter of recommendation is going to take 30 minutes. I'm going to put it into my little time schedule, and I'm going to be able to get it done. First-year students are lousy at predicting time on task because they use their high school time on task predictions. And then we teach them time and behavior management, and it falls apart because they're not good at predicting time on task. So oftentimes what I do in the classroom is when I'm giving students an assignment, I tell them what the time on task is going to be so that I can help them self-regulate and do their planning. So self-regulatory behaviors are at the heart of being successful in college. So if we can work on helping students develop those self-regulatory behaviors, again, predicts with about 35% variance of college achievement. The biggest challenge for students is procrastination. We could probably spend a few hours talking about procrastination. The problem with procrastination is procrastinatory behaviors are highly idiosyncratic. We all do it a little bit differently. I could certainly talk to you about patterns of procrastination. We know that one huge pattern of procrastination is self-deception and lying. We often lie to ourselves, and that's what feeds into procrastination. And it's a self-regulatory behavior that we don't understand so well. There's a huge connection with procrastination and emotions. So what I have students do to help them think about their procrastinatory behaviors is I have them keep a lie log. Go through a whole week and keep a lie log, and then we kind of analyze the kind of lies that they say to themselves. So again, I want you to raise your hand if you use a snooze alarm. Okay, so you're procrastinating your first activity of the day, getting out of bed, right? Another activity I do with students to get them to reflect on their procrastination is this, go through this series of questions. And I think one of the most powerful things that students can do is identify what their replacement activities are. Because most of us have replacement activities that we utilize to procrastinate. Mine's email. I convinced myself that it's so important to get on email. So reflecting on procrastinatory behaviors, I think, is absolutely key for students. Then there's those self-concept pieces that we talked about before. We all have what's called a phenomenal field, and things in our phenomenal field prevent us from getting involved in the pursuit of achievement, for enacting particular behaviors. And I think for students, this is often what's in their phenomenal field, right? That sense of that they don't belong or they're not competent. And again, I take a psychoeducational approach with my students, and I talk to them about the imposter syndrome, and we process that. And this is particularly powerful phenomenon for first-year students when they're trying to figure out their sense of belongingness at an institution of higher education. So I want you to take a look at this student's musing. This was a student who asked me if they could drop a student success course, and I told them that they needed to reflect on why they thought that they should drop it. And then this was excerpted from an essay that they gave me before I made the decision whether I was going to sign the drop slip. So he stayed in the course, but if I really could dissect his phenomenal field of what was going on and dig in more deeply to why he was struggling, so you can see all the social and emotional components of the engagement process here. Another strategy I use when I'm giving students an assignment, before they walk away, I go, on a scale from 1 to 10, I want you to assess your self-efficacy. I just gave you this assignment. Give me a number. And if students say 7, my self-efficacy is a 7, I'll say, okay, what's the 8, 9, 10 roadblock that's getting in the way? And let's figure out what they are, and I'll help you remove those roadblocks so that you can reach mastery with this project. So really, at every educational level, this is about a psychology of adjustment. And there are 6 major areas of adjustment, and we're utilizing this framework now to talk to parents, students, and families and institutional stakeholders about the adjustment phases at every stage of transitioning from different levels of education. So I will quickly iterate for you at college what the huge adjustment factors are here as you're thinking about readying your emerging leaders and you're thinking about readying your students for college. By and large, the 2 academic adjustment issues at college, and I mentioned these, are reading and behavior management. The social adjustment is very difficult at this age and stage. I want you to think about what it's like, particularly for residential students at college. It's one gigantic pajama party. Students go off to college, they're in the residence hall, and it's a gigantic pajama party, and they really get caught up in the social aspect and the peer pressure. And procrastinators recruit other people to procrastinate with them. Why do we do that, right? Why are all the probation kids sitting together in the cafeteria, right? We all want to go down the rabbit hole together, so the social adjustment in college is super difficult. The emotional adjustment. The emotional adjustment has to do with being away from friends and family and tapping into that sense of belongingness. The intellectual adjustment is when values are tested, when we learn that women aren't making the same amount as men are making, and it tests your values and it changes you. Students are going to be living and learning in a new cultural environment in college. And they have to be able to adjust. And when we talk about Roger's phenomenal field, he says that students have to be open to new experiences. And in college, they're going to be facing lots of new experiences. And so we have to cultivate that personality trait of being open to new experiences. And of course, the financial adjustment for students is huge in college. If we can use this framework to help students think about their adjustment to college and use this framework to help parents and families think about adjustment to college, it gives students, parents, and families a common language to talk about this new experience. So a strategy now for colleges and universities and looking for help from K through 12 educators is to begin to talk about the implications of the college experience and that adjustment to college so that we can help students transition from their first year to second year and we can have higher retention rates. And we also want to educate students about these big questions. What does it take to be a leader? What does it mean to be successful in college? On your tables is an innovative mechanism that colleges and universities are using right now to help educate parents and families. And we're doing some work on this related to the high school level so that we can help parents and families at the high school level know what it takes to be successful. This is another resource for parents and families to help them think about the college transition. Particularly helpful for parents who haven't gone to college to understand all of the different components of higher education. For folks who are looking for resources at the high school level, there's a wonderful book and website called Higher Ed Parent that is really aimed at first-generation students to help them understand what it takes to be successful in college. So we want to be mindful, right, of engaging parents and families. We want to figure out support mechanisms that can help support parents and families at any stage, consider all the generational stakeholders, look at the individual traits and the environmental situations that are going on, and figure out how we can get the students to thrive in our environments. And answer that big question of what do you want to do when you grow up? I would recommend for high school educators to have students take a look at this. This is a terrific TED Talk by Emily Wapnick that really talks about the way that society is morphing, the way boundaries in terms of content areas are morphing, and how new fields are emerging and new disciplines are emerging, and how the individual can cultivate talents. And she talks about how students could be considered multi-potentialites, that they don't only have to focus on one discipline, but they can be multi-potentialites. And so really what this boils down to is the habits of mind that it takes to be successful in college, in life, and career. And I believe from my research and practice that these are the top 10 traits that it takes for students to be successful in their pursuit of higher education. So there are lots of answers to this questions of what does it take to be successful, but I believe that these are the top 10 habits of mind that students need to be successful in higher education, particularly during the first year, but I think that all of these traits can be transferred into a work environment. So thank you very much.